Hi everybody, we're just waiting for everybody to join and get settled, which seems to be happening, and then I will introduce our speakers for today. And anybody who's attended before will know we'll be talking, Mary and Debbie will be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we will have some questions at the end, but feel free to pop your questions in the chat as you think of them, and then we will go through them at the end of the session. I am going to introduce our speakers today in a moment, and then annoyingly for me, I have to head off at 4:45 because I'm teaching at 5 o'clock. But Matt Slocum has kindly agreed to host the questions at the end. So thank you, Matt. So when I've all of a sudden disappeared, now you know why. Okay, so let me now introduce our speakers. We are lucky enough to have two speakers today who are going to be talking to us about their work in autism. So Dr. Mary Hanley is an Associate Professor of Developmental Psychology and a Co-Director for the Centre of Neurodiversity and Development at Durham University. Her research has mostly focused on understanding strengths and challenges for neurodiverse groups, especially for autistic people and people with Williams syndrome. She has a particular interest in how differences with attention, arousal, and anxiety can interact and lead to challenges in educational settings. She's recently been leading on translating research evidence to practice with educational professionals by developing an online training tool designed to change understanding of the AAA challenges in schools, which we're going to be hearing about today, aren't we? So Professor Debbie Riby is a Professor of Developmental Psychology and Co-Director of the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development at Durham. Her research largely focuses on the neurodevelopmental conditions of Williams syndrome and autism, and her interests span cognition, behaviour and mental health. Her work takes a multi-methods approach involving a range of quantitative and qualitative methodologies, which I always find impressive. Research projects have both delved deeply into one neurodevelopmental condition and taking cross-syndrome approaches to understand syndrome-specific signatures versus broader elements of neurodiversity. She is keen to ensure her research has real-world relevance, as does Mary. And Debbie is also chair, as I said, of the developmental psychology section of the BPS and a member of the professional advisory panel of the Williams Syndrome Foundation. As well as conducting her research on neurodevelopmental conditions, Debbie spends half of her week as director of the ESRC funded Northeast and Northern Ireland Doctoral Training Partnership. Phew, that's quite a lot for both of you. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is ask you to share your slides, and then I will turn off my camera and my microphone. I'll keep my microphone on so I can tell you that your slides are being seen, and then I will hand over to you to give your talk. So your slides are visible. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Lovely, thank you. It's great. Thank you very much for that lovely and long introduction to us both. We're really pleased to be able to speak to you today about a programme of research that we've been conducting and most recently translating into impactful work in practice and showing you how we've taken that journey from conducting that research in the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development and putting that into practice most recently in our work. So we're going to do this as a bit of a double act. We've done that a few times recently and it's gone well so far, so fingers crossed it works well today. So we'll both be presenting different elements of the presentation today. We are really aware that there's a broad audience from some academics and researchers, but also practitioners, and we've tried to pitch the talk as a broad audience so that hopefully it will be relevant to as many people as possible, and hopefully we've got that pitch right as we go through the presentation.
Super, thanks, Debbie. So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about the approach that underpins the work that we're going to be talking about today. I know this is probably familiar to many people, but it's worth just starting off by saying a little bit about neurodiversity. You know, this is the idea that all of our brains work differently, and as such, we all think and we all behave differently. When we talk about neurodivergence, we're talking about differences in thinking and behaviour that diverge from what's considered neurotypical. And sometimes neurodivergent people can experience particular challenges in certain situations. Autism is a form of neurodivergence. And again, I'm assuming that most people have a good understanding really of what autism is. I assume most people know that, you know, autistic people have a range of strengths and challenges, strengths with attention to detail and visual perception, and some particular challenges when it comes to sensory differences in everyday situations, and also heightened anxiety, two things we're particularly going to focus on today. In this work that we're going to be talking about today, there will be a focus on challenges at school. And that's because the school environment can provide really, really significant challenges for many autistic learners. The evidence that we'll talk about has primarily involved autistic children and young people, but I hope what will be clear is actually the relevance of it, and hopefully the relevance of the training tool we'll talk about is much broader than for autistic people and is relevant for neurodivergent learners more generally. So what do we know about learning and school life for autistic pupils? Well, in terms of learning, if we look at the literature, there's been a good deal of focus on things like academic achievement and using standardized measures of academic achievement and looking at the predictors of academic achievement. And what we can see from this literature is often very uneven profiles of achievement, very variable outcomes, sometimes overachievement that might be predicted by IQ, sometimes underachievement that might be predicted by IQ. So really huge variability, both between autistic individuals and also for the same person within academic areas such as reading or math. So really the point is huge variability. But there's a trend in that evidence to suggest underachievement across sort of on average, if you like. And we know from GCSE data that autistic learners do experience an academic attainment gap compared to their non-autistic peers. And of course, academics are really, really important. But one of the things that we will emphasize today is that we really need to think more broadly, and we really need to think about school life. We know that autistic learners experience higher levels of exclusions from school compared to pupils without additional learning needs, that they can experience quite a lot of bullying at school, that when autistic young people were asked through the All-Party Parliamentary Group report in 2017 about whether they were happy with school, fewer than half said they were happy at school, and 6 out of 10 said, you know, the main thing that would make school better is having a teacher who understands them. So that sort of really sense that they're not happy and they really don't feel sort of understood and accepted at school. And for that reason, it's not really surprising that although we have really quite limited figures or data on this, it's not surprising that school refusal and difficulty staying at school on a school day are really quite significantly higher for autistic pupils. So the data suggests about 5% with school refusal in the general school population and about 21% for autistic pupils. And in our work in the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development, we've been for a number of years now really trying to understand some of the things that can help us explain engagement and learning for autistic pupils. We've done this in a variety of different ways, using different methods and approaches and looking at different educational settings as well. So in some of our work, we've done some stuff with autistic university students in the UK, trying to understand their academic and their social experiences at university. Most of our work really though has focused on children of primary school age, and this is work that involves experimental empirical studies looking at attention as a predictor of learning and attentional profiles as predictors of learning. Also looking at impacts from the classroom environment on attention, such as classroom displays. But it also, questionnaire, survey and interview work with parents and teachers and families to probe aspects of sensory impacts and anxiety at school. One of the really important points, I think, that comes from this work is the overlap between these issues of attentional differences, sensory arousal differences, and heightened anxiety. And, you know, where we've in some of these studies taken a particular view or a focus on, say, sensory arousal, what's become clear is that the overlap with it and, say, anxiety was really crucial to understand the outcome. So that's really where this idea and this framework of AAA came from, that, you know, when you look at some of these issues like attention, arousal and anxiety, what you find when you look is actually this huge overlap between them. I think the other really important point to emphasize from the outset is that to really understand engagement and learning for autistic pupils, you know, the tendency so far has largely been to look at factors that are specific or internal to a child or a young person, such as their IQ or their academic ability. And really we need to think about aspects of the classroom environment and the school environment. This is a fairly typical representation of a primary school classroom in the UK. And, you know, these environments are very busy. They're very multisensory. There's lots of things children have to filter out and ignore in order to be able to engage and to be able to pay attention and hopefully to be able to learn. You know, we could be thinking about the physical classroom environment and how much sensory stimulation there is from the physical classroom environment, such as displays on classroom walls. But equally, you know, just thinking about the noise and bustle from a classroom that might have up to 30 kids, you know, thinking about a mainstream classroom. And of course, we know that 70% of autistic pupils in the UK are in mainstream classrooms. So very busy classrooms full of noise and bustle. And these can often be quite unpredictable environments for those reasons. For some children, you know, engaging in an environment like this is not difficult, and for some children it's very, very difficult, especially for children who have difficulties or differences with attention, arousal and anxiety. If you have attention differences or difficulties, it can be really hard to stay focused on task, even and especially when there are other things to capture your attention. If you have arousal differences, it means that everyday sensory inputs that most people don't, you know, pay attention to or seem to notice, they can actually be completely overwhelming, and that can be very distressing. Equally, you know, these could be sensory inputs that most people notice that, but if you're sort of experience hypoarousal, you fail to notice. And on top of that, you know, if you have anxiety, heightened anxiety, the world feels like a very unpredictable place. That's a very distressing experience, and it makes it very difficult to focus on anything except, you know, that feeling of anxiety or the thing that's causing you anxiety. As I say, some children have some of these difficulties, some children have none, but they're really quite common for autistic children and young people, and they tend to experience all three together. And they're also experienced by other neurodivergent learners as well. So the aim really of our work is to translate some of the evidence that we've collected to practice with educational professionals primarily. And it's really about changing understanding of these AAA issues and challenges at school to help, you know, support children and young people in our schools who experience AAA. And really important to say from the outset that our AAA work has been co-designed with key stakeholders, autistic people, parents, families, teachers and educational psychologists. And actually the images that you see here and through the talk to convey AAA issues were brilliantly done by Ella Willis, who is an autistic digital illustrator who's worked with us on this programme of work. So what is the evidence that I keep referring to? Well, from the work that we've done and for the AAA training, we've honed in on 3 specific examples to try and illustrate these issues around attention, arousal and anxiety. What we're going to do now is just talk through each one in turn. So the first example was an experimental study that we conducted to really look at the effect of classroom displays on attention and learning. There's lots of reasons why we decorate our classrooms. Sometimes it's about supporting learning, so putting learning aids on the wall. Sometimes it's about, you know, making the classroom look like a bright, colourful, stimulating place. And sometimes it's about celebrating children's work. But we became interested in thinking about whether the presence of these displays, particularly high levels of decoration, could actually have some negative consequences for attention and subsequently for learning. And to look at this, we designed excuse me, an experiment using a series of videoed mini lessons that we created. And we had autistic and non-autistic children take part. So there were 17 per group, and they were matched on verbal mental age. So the video mini lessons we created looked like this. This is a screenshot on the bottom of the slide there from both versions. For each video, we made a no display version and we made a high display version. And we counterbalanced across groups, and all children saw, I think, 4 video lessons in total. We used eye tracking to measure attention while children watch the video lessons, and eye tracking gives you a very precise and accurate measure of what someone pays attention to, when and for how long. And I'll show you an example of some eye tracking data in a minute. And we created an assessment of learning at the end of each video lesson. And each video lesson was 5 minutes long. So what did we find? Well, looking at attention to the background, this graph shows you the percentage of attention that children paid to the background, so not the teacher, but everything else in the background. And this was from, the data you can see is from videos where there were no displays present. And what you see is that autistic and non-autistic children spend very similar proportions or percentages of time looking at the background when there are no displays, and it's really quite minimal. It's about 10% across those videos. And just to give you a sense of what that eye tracking data looked like, I'm going to show you a video that it's called a heat map video. So you're going to see the gaze overlays or the attention patterns of 8 autistic participants when they watched a video with no displays in the background.
Okay, children, we're now going to have a lesson on a myth or a legend. Now, a myth or a legend is an old story that's passed down through people from generation to generation. In this legend, we will learn about...
And so what you see there is probably what you would have expected. You know, children are paying attention to the teacher who's relaying the information about the lesson verbally. So here is a different set of autistic participants, 9 autistic participants. It's the same lesson, but this time with displays in the background.
Okay, children, we're now going to have a lesson on a myth or a legend. Now, a myth or a legend is an old story that's passed down through people from generation to generation. In this legend, we will learn about the...
And what you see there is a very different attention pattern, which is much more directed towards the very kind of interesting, bright, colourful displays in the background. So what did things look like overall? So now in the graph, we have red bars, which show you the percentage of attention children paid to the background in videos when displays were present. And what you can see is that all children look more at displays when they're present. But autistic participants did this to a much greater extent, a significantly greater extent. And what was also interesting is the presence of displays changed the attentional priority. Now, what I mean is, when there were no displays present, both groups spent more time looking at the teacher than they did the background. When displays were present, both groups increased their looking to displays when they were present. But for the autistic children in this study, attentional priority changed, whereby they now spent much more time looking at the background than they did the teacher. Whereas for the neurotypical children, even though they increased their attention to the background, they still spent more time paying attention to the teacher, paying overt attention. Overt attention is an important point, because you could say, well, does it matter? I can think about one thing and be looking at something else. And indeed, you know, Debbie has done lots of work on gaze aversion. Sometimes it's really important to look away from a person to support your thinking, for example, with maths problems. In this study, it did matter because we did, in our regressions, where we looked at things like age, verbal ability, sustained attention ability, and attention to displays as predictors. Attention to displays, the amount of time children spent looking at displays, was the best predictor of learning. in that condition, and really more looking at displays predicted poorer learning. And so really what that told us, or what we took from that, is that sometimes classroom displays can be distracting, and to a greater extent for autistic children. You might say, well, that's really interesting. You're talking about video mini lessons. How does this bear any resemblance to what might happen in a classroom? Well, we've tried to replicate this recently by constructing our own mini classroom. And we had autistic and non-autistic participants come in on 4 separate occasions to do classroom tasks, so reading comprehension tasks in this environment. We video recorded the children while they did these tasks, and we coded behaviour for on and off task behaviour. And I'll just show you a little clip from one participant. And of course, the crucial thing here, you're seeing a child in a condition with high visual displays. The crucial thing here is, of course, we manipulated what the sensory information in the classroom environment. So there were 4 different conditions. In the baseline, it was just the bare classroom. There was no displays, and there was silence. In audio, we had an audio recording of classroom noise. In visual, the one you could see in the video, the children could just see visual displays in the classroom, and in audio visual, they could hear the classroom noise and they could see the visual displays. When visual displays were present, we were able to see significantly more off-task behaviour for all children, both autistic and non-autistic children. And we were able to then look at that off-task behaviour and see what drove it. And it was driven by actually looking at the displays on the wall, by looking at the environment. And what this tells us is that sensory features of the classroom can impact attention and learning. And from our data, it seems to be to a much greater extent for autistic children.
So that leads us nicely into thinking about the role of sensory and arousal on learning and school life, and leads us to another study that we've conducted on this issue. So although we now understand a good deal about sensory differences in autism from a wide range in literature on the topic, we do know relatively little about precisely how these issues impact learning and school life. So in this study, we were interested in conducting a questionnaire study with parents and teachers, and we had 57 parents and 70 teachers take part in this questionnaire study, asking them about sensory impacts at school for primary school aged pupils, autistic pupils. And there were 3 core areas of the questionnaire that they answered on. So we were interested in how to identify sensory differences affecting behaviour, the types of sensory experiences encountered at school for autistic pupils, and the impact of sensory differences on learning for autistic pupils. So to go through the results, what some of the data told us, well, 71% of teachers believed that sensory differences affected learning frequently or all the time for autistic pupils. And parents thought it was even greater than that. So 81% of parents felt that sensory differences affected life at school. Really high numbers, big proportions of parents and teachers endorsing the impact of sensory differences on school life and learning. And of course, it's really important to think about the fact that parents and teachers are really responding to the observable features and reactions that they can see when a pupil might be experiencing a reaction to their sensory environment. Of course, we might be missing very many more subtle indicators of sensory impacts until that cup is overflowing, and it's most likely that what we're seeing here is actually once the pupil, the autistic pupil, really is at that peak impact of sensory input. So actually there might be even more impacts than we're seeing here in this data. And it's also relevant to emphasize that actually hypersensitivities to sensory input are more readily, more easy for us to detect and identify in a pupil than, for example, slightly harder to spot hyposensitivity to sensory input. So we have here a quote from one of the teachers of autistic pupils, emphasizing very outward observable behavioral reactions to hypersensitivity in their sensory environment at school. So they try to protect themselves by covering their ears, closing their eyes, pulling their t-shirts over their noses to block out the smells. So particularly they're about smell as a sensory reaction. So if we think about some of the areas of sensory input that the parents and teachers emphasize to us, these are in order of priority. So the most significant impact sensory inputs were in auditory stimuli. For example, loud, unpredictable noises in the school bathrooms, if there's a hand dryer, the school bell going off, or a fire alarm going off. And any of you that might have worked with pupils in schools might know that those times can be particularly challenging, especially any unpredictable noises for autistic pupils or neurodivergent pupils more broadly. Then there's also the noise from other pupils, especially in mainstream schools, where, as Mary said, we know 70% or so of autistic pupils are in mainstream schools. These are really busy classrooms, other pupils in the class, potentially maybe up to 30 other children within the classroom. So auditory stimulus from the noise of the other pupils in that class and in the wider school environment. But also more subtle auditory sensory sensitivities. So right down to the sound of pens or pens on paper or pencils, and on the whiteboard as well, that squeaking noise that sometimes you get, what we might, the older ones of us think about chalk on the chalkboard. So a really wide-ranging auditory sensitivities being reported in this area. What was reported in the next most common domain, well, this was a tactile domain. I've already touched on the fact that the classroom, the school environment is busy with lots of other pupils, and that feeds into both auditory and tactile experiences and the sensory world at school. So teachers and parents reported about children reacting to touch from others, for example, sitting very closely together around a table, or if you're sitting on carpet time to listen to a story, for example, or in assembly time where lots of the students are all sat next to each other. But even outside of the classroom and in the wider school environment, walking down corridors, for example, passing other pupils if it's really busy in a bustling school environment. There was huge diversity in the tactile reactivity that was reported. There were real extremes. Some students, autistic pupils actually seeking out tactile sensory inputs, so perhaps hugging or touching others, tapping or using fidget toys, etc. So actually huge variability in the types of tactile responses that pupils might experience. And just to emphasize this unpredictability coming up as a core theme lots of times in the reports from parents and teachers across lots of these settings, and especially in some of that individual variability seen in the tactile domain. Mary's already focused a lot on visual attention, and visual stimulus in the school environment, again, is readily available. So focused on the classroom setting and the busy environment, visual environment of the classroom. But even fluorescent lighting in the corridors or in classrooms, and the broader, wider visual environment of school, not just in the classroom, but throughout the school environment, came up time and again in reports from parents and teachers. And slightly less frequently reported, but still highly impactful, were smell and taste sensory inputs. And again, these are often outside of the classroom, but in the wider school environment. So for example, smells and taste at lunchtime or when getting changed for PE, but it might also be cleaning products that the cleaners have used in a classroom the night before, a perfume that a teacher might be wearing or a classroom assistant might be wearing. So lots of individual inputs, sort of characteristics to this in terms of the types of inputs both and experiences both in the classroom and the wider school environment. So these are the areas of sensory differences that parents and teachers reported impacting learning most significantly for autistic pupils. But how do these impact the learning? What did parents and teachers say? So we looked at the core themes that came out from what they were telling us, and there were two core themes. One, largely the most common one, around sensory inputs causing distraction from learning. So if you've got this really busy sensory environment, all of these sensory inputs, and your body's reacting to all of those, actually it's very difficult to do anything else. You're distracted by that sensory input in your sensory world. So a quote here from a teacher: it's an inability to tune out the noises they don't need, affecting their ability to listen to instructions and input. And another teacher: because if a child is more focused on what they're wearing, it distracts them from their work. So really impacting their ability to concentrate and to learn in class. There was another theme, and again, this overlaps with one of the other AAA areas that we're particularly interested in. This came up time and again, in these sensory inputs and impacts really causing distress and anxiety. So this link between sensory issues and anxiety. And this is a lovely quote actually from a parent. I think it really brings to life some of the issues. We can imagine what this would be like. So she either appears anxious or angry. How can you possibly learn with all that adrenaline rushing through you? It's like asking someone to do long division when they're free falling from a plane. It's not going to happen. So there's distress and the impact of those sensory inputs, and really thinking about what we're asking somebody to do when they're considering these sensory inputs, and we're also expecting them and hoping that they will learn in that classroom. Oh yeah. And this very much fits with the experiences of autistic adolescent learners. And we know this from other work in the literature from other researchers, as well as additional work that we've done with autistic adolescents. So for example, here, study by Howe and Stagg in 2016 was looking at the sensory experiences of autistic adolescents. And they asked autistic pupils attending mainstream secondary schools to complete the adolescent and adult sensory profile questionnaire, along with some open-ended qualitative questions as well. Auditory differences were perceived to be the most disruptive for learning. That very much follows what we've just seen parents and teachers telling us as the most significant area, followed by tactile, olfactory, and visual differences. So participants in that study explained that sensory differences impacted learning by disrupting their concentration, causing their anxiety, and causing physical discomfort. So that very much overlaps what we've seen here in the reports of what parents and teachers are telling us about those experiences. And there are further examples of our own work in this area as part of the AAA resource and on our website, which Mary will come to. But I think this quote also from some of our own work emphasizes the issues. I think mainly it's worth understanding that for people like me, our senses, and we got sensory overload much faster than neurotypical people. I can only handle so much noise or something. Other kids can cope, but being in a noisy classroom, I can't. So the real world experiences of autistic adolescents very much mapping on to some of those insights from parents and teachers, seeing these observable issues from the behaviours of pupils within the classroom. Another quote here, just to illustrate the same points. What I do like is not just for attention, it's because I actually can't really cope if there's like a fly or something that smells bad. So really emphasizing that they have no choice. It's really significantly impacting upon their ability to concentrate and function and learn in that environment. So the third area we want to focus on is anxiety. And actually you've just seen there that some of the themes that are coming up are these sensory inputs linking to anxiety in autistic pupils. And this study really makes a point about anxiety. This was an interview study with a relatively small group of teachers. It was actually a study where we asked teachers very broad and open questions about what they thought were the most significant barriers and facilitators for autistic pupils' learning and engagement at school. Although there are lots of different barriers and facilitators that were identified, one of the strongest messages that came across was that of anxiety. So this wasn't a study where we were purposefully going to look for and ask questions about anxiety. Actually, when we asked broader questions about facilitators and barriers, teachers spontaneously brought up anxiety many times in their interview responses. So to anyone who works with autistic pupils or knows the research literature on autism, that won't come as a surprise. There is lots of evidence that speaks to the issues of anxiety and this being a significant problem for autistic pupils. But what this study emphasised was that it was important in the classroom and for learning. Just to emphasise, you can see lots of themes that came up, core themes around at the academic environment, and Mary has already mentioned about understanding not only the internal experiences of the pupil, but also that classroom environment. Those individual issues such as pupil behaviours and abilities, and also the teacher as well, and teachers' qualities in terms of understanding the pupils as well. And if we look at some of the themes that came up around the pupil abilities and behaviours, anxiety and attention and sensory issues and social communication were core themes that came up. And as you can see, they map very clearly actually onto many of the issues that we've been honing into because of this type of underpinning study that we've conducted. So as I say, anxiety emerged as one of the strongest themes in this study, really ensuring that for us that we were embedding anxiety in the work that we were doing and showing how it links to other areas of the sensory experiences, the attentional experiences, and the everyday functioning of autistic pupils at school. Just again, a quote from one of the teachers: their anxiety levels go up so high they can't think. So again, emphasising that anxiety impacting upon learning. And that doesn't seem surprising when we think about a school environment also being really uncertain, and that sensory uncertainty as well that we've just focused on in the previous study. So all of these things coming together. So one of the things that we've also been thinking about is what might underlie all of these issues, what might the mechanisms be that underlie these experiences of sensory, anxiety, and attentional contributions to functioning at school, the AAA issues that we call them. Well, the answer, of course, is that there might be a number of different mechanisms at play here. There's probably not one clear answer to that question. And there's not one reason that can be provided to explain why AAA issues all occur together. There are probably multiple mechanisms at play. But one of the important theoretical models that has emerged in the field, and especially in terms of autism and anxiety, is the idea of an intolerance of uncertainty. And if you think about being in an unpredictable school environment, if there are unpredictable noises, the fire alarm going off or the bell going off, for example, that can have a real impact on sensory issues, on anxiety issues, and on your ability to pay attention. And a number of groups now have focused in on intolerance of uncertainty as a route to supporting anxiety needs, especially, and in order to think about some of the potential mechanisms that might underlie some of these issues. So it's really relevant for us that intolerance of uncertainty really does link to many of the issues that we are focusing on in this work. So for us, understanding the role of intolerance of uncertainty could help us to focus our support strategies in the right place, most importantly. For example, that avoidance as a strategy is only going to get you so far, and that ultimately helping to manage uncertainty and building up your tolerance to uncertainty is probably a much more productive way forward to supporting everyday functioning. So what we've tried to do in these three research examples, as well as using testimony from autistic people, from parents, from teachers, is to convey why AAA may have such a significant impact at school for so many autistic young people, and indeed for neurodivergent learners at school more broadly. The key message is that attention, sensory arousal, and anxiety are all strongly linked to each other, and have a knock-on impact upon each other. We've emphasised those sensory issues impacting anxiety impacting your ability to pay attention, etc. It really is all linked together, it seems, in the daily experiences of autistic learners at school. It goes without saying that there are considerable individual differences, of course, in how these impact and how these are experienced for pupils and students in the classroom. How one autistic pupil experiences AAA and the support that's needed will be very different to another. And anybody who's worked in the classroom with autistic pupils will know that every individual will have different needs, and the same individual will have different needs at different times. It's also worth emphasising that although the examples that we've used today and the examples from our own research have highlighted and focused on autism, we think that they're really relevant to other neurodivergent groups. For example, much of our other work focuses on Williams syndrome, and there's many overlaps with these 3 AAA issues in Williams syndrome, and of course in ADHD as well. The important thing is that these internal states of anxiety, attentional issues, and arousal are ones that most children and young people find hard to articulate. How do you explain some of these concepts? They really are complicated, they are internal states. And with this research and the training tool that we're developing, we want to raise awareness and understanding of these issues so that we can better recognise these experiences and support these needs with AAA in the classroom for autistic learners. That is important because it's worth emphasising the Nordic relational model of social relational model of disability really says that disability occurs when there is this mismatch between the environment and the person's skills or abilities and their coping. And here we're really emphasising why aspects of the school environment can create difficulties for autistic pupils. And it might be that small changes to that environment can be really helpful and not disabling in this manner.
Super, thanks Debbie. So then just the last little bit of this talk is really going to focus on the online training tool that we've developed. So you've heard the research examples and some of the personal testimony, and it's really this that we use to form the basis of the online training tool. And the purpose is really to try and change understanding, but also to provide practical strategies and support. So the online training tool is mostly targeted at educational professionals. That's who we sort of had in mind, but equally it's open to whoever wants to use it. And so far we've had nearly 900 people use it, and most of those have been teachers, but equally we've had a good deal of families and other professionals as well. And that's the link for it there on the slides, and we can share that again afterwards. It's really important, before I say much more about the training team, to emphasize it wasn't just our team involved in creating this. We worked with our collaborative partners in Durham County Council. So this was the communication and interaction team. This is the group of people responsible for supporting neurodivergent learners across County Durham in our schools, made up of educational psychologists, special advisory teachers. Crucially, we had an absolutely wonderful advisory committee. So this was made up of autistic young people, autistic adults, parents, teachers and other autism academics as well, and they really helped develop all aspects of the tool. And of course I have to acknowledge Curious 12, who were the web developers, because we know nothing about anything to do with websites, and that became abundantly clear as we took on this project. So it was co-designed. Really important feature of this training. Really important feature is that it is free. It's accessible to anybody who wants to use it. It takes about an hour and a half to complete on average, and anybody who completes it will get a personalised certificate of completion. We know from our development work that that was really important for teachers, that they had something to show as evidence for having done the training. And equally, everybody who does it will be able to download the AAA toolbox. And that's just the bit I'm going to focus on now, because this is the practical support strategies bit. This bit was developed with our advisory group, but also drew a lot from the experience and expertise of the communication and interaction team from Durham County Council. And the idea here is that by the end of the training, you can create your own toolbox. You can select the strategies that are useful to you to support the children that are, and young people that you are working with. And we provide a range of different strategies, each of which can be tailored to an individual person. And we provide a range of strategies. And I'm just going to give you a flavour of some of those. So if you're thinking about supporting attention differences, can you be selective about the display? So we're not saying, based on the evidence that we have, strip all your classrooms bare, but we are suggesting that you could be selective. So consider using feature walls or folding boards, because these can actually act, have a double purpose, if you like, and act as an attentional cue and actually help transition between lessons. And this kind of strategy can be used at all key stages. But along with that, you might want to audit your environment, and we provide some hints, or sorry, some tips and strategies as to how you might go about auditing your environment, your classroom environment. If you're thinking about arousal and sensory issues, this example is something that you can use both to help somebody regulate, but also potentially to help somebody who's experiencing sensory distress. So can you make a sensory cool box? So a collection of preferred sensory items specific to the individuals. These might be stress balls, they might be calming tubes or scented items, chewy items. Chewing can be quite good for managing sensory arousal, and suggestions then for how you might adapt it depending on the age of the child or the young person that you're supporting. In thinking about anxiety, can you offer a soft landing to school? So you might offer some pupils a very kind of predictable low demand entry to school, either with it, like, for example, a staggered start time. Can they start or come into class 5 minutes before everybody else comes? Or can they come in 5 minutes later, you know, when the bustle has settled down? Could they meet a trusted staff member on entry who can help them make that transition into school in the mornings? Because that's often a really difficult time of day for many autistic and neurodivergent learners at school. So that's really a very brief flavour of the practical support strategies. The whole toolbox in total has about 35. Really important to say, we're not suggesting this is kind of like a magic bullet. You know, this is something to help particularly educational professionals put in place tailorable support strategies for children and young people. Children and young people change and develop. And so, you know, the AAA toolbox, the idea here isn't like a fix. It should be a starting point, and it should enable professionals to develop further strategies based on the kind of things that we suggest. We launched on the 24th of March, so we're almost 2 months since launch, and we've had over 850 users so far, which has been really, really positive, and even more positive than the number of people who signed up. The feedback we've had from people who've completed it has been really positive. It's probably the best feedback I've ever gotten on anything I've done so far. It's certainly better than some of my MEQs, which are also good, but this is better. So people finding the training really useful, you know, learning from it, think that it'll help them support young people. Saying importantly that it will change, that they'll use it to change what they do. And also if we can look at pre and post self-reported measures of knowledge and confidence in supporting AAA issues. And what we're seeing is significant positive increases in both knowledge and confidence. So really pleased so far that it seems to be getting out there to people, and people are positive about using the online training. And so then just really quickly before we finish, this is a program of work that we're, you know, continuing to expand, and the online training tool was the first phase in the translation to practice, if you like, from the evidence that we've been gathering. The next step, which is actually just started, is about developing manualized training for whole schools to do at one time. What's the difference, you might ask? Well, who's likely to do, you know, a self-selected online training course in this area? People who are really interested and driven and motivated to seek out this information in the first place for whatever reason. Actually, who we potentially is, you know, even more important to get the message to, might be people who aren't intrinsically motivated to do online training in the area. So what we want to do is develop a manual that a SENCO in a school can actually deliver to the whole school at one time point, and therefore get a consistency of practice around supporting AAA needs in the school across the whole school at one time point. We're also doing work now with 2 master's students, Dora and Esther, here at Durham, on barriers to PE at school. We know that autistic people engage in less physical activity and much less PE at school than non-autistic peers. And it seems, certainly from the work that we've done on this so far, that AAA can help us understand what some of those barriers are. But with our PhD researchers, Jess Hurst, who's already begun, and Gemma Semley, who's beginning, both funded by the ESRC, we're looking more generally at what does school success look like for autistic pupils, especially around inclusion and belonging. So linking to some of the stuff I said at the outset of this talk, you know, if you want to look at academic achievement and learning, there's really good reasons to do that. But if children and young people can't be in school, be comfortable in school and engage in school, then it's really difficult to, you know, promote learning and achievement, really. And finally, just another project that we're beginning in September with another ESRC funded PhD student, Chloe Fielding, and also investing in children who are a children's rights organisation based in Durham. We're going to be probing in more detail the issues around anxiety at school, and in particular, how anxiety contributes to school refusal. So they're the ways that we're taking this work forward. So on that note, I would just say thank you to the Centre for Educational Neuroscience for inviting us to give this talk. It's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share this work with you. But of course, a huge thanks to all of our advisors, all of our participants, families and schools, our wonderful collaborators, and our funders as well. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thanks, Chloe. Really fascinating project and lovely presentation. So we've got some time for questions now. We've got a few already in the chat box. I might just jump straight into those so we can get through them. So Julie Bailey's asking, given that some autistic pupils have reported benefits from periods of remote learning, if we assume that this is at least partly due to being in a more controlled sensory environment, do you think we now can expect to see more people struggling with typical classroom environments? That
is an absolutely super and extremely timely question. So if you look at some of the work that was done on COVID and lockdowns and what happened with home learning for autistic pupils, I think by and large, learning at home and remote learning wasn't particularly easy, but about 30% found that actually it was more positive. By 30% find remote learning and learning at home to be more positive. I think those who find it difficult found that it was difficult to engage children via remote methods. So for a proportion of children, it was difficult to engage via that means. But for most autistic pupils, at least in the studies that I've looked at, the transition back to school after lockdowns has been exceptionally difficult. And you know, the suggestion coming from that work is that that's a lot to do with the sensory environment, that actually making that transition back into that environment has just been really, really difficult. The pandemic upended so many things in so many ways and has a terrible impact on so many people in so many different ways. But it has forced us to consider certain things in a different light. And, you know, I think one of the things that's interesting is it really, I think, has shed a light on how difficult school environments are for many young people, particularly autistic young people. And actually, can we be more creative and use the kind of methods and remote learning methods that we've had to develop? Can we use those better now to support kids who particularly find the school environment really difficult? I think it's raised some really interesting questions, and I think it's going to be a really interesting time to look at those in more detail. I hope that's answered the question.
And just to add, it's the same, not just in primary school children as well, university students as well, seeing neurodivergent university students, the thought of going back into a lecture theatre with 500 or so other students in there. So it's an issue that transcends educational settings. I think it's not just an issue that is for primary school, secondary school pupils, but also for university students as well, which is something that we're looking a little bit at as well.
Lynn has, she's saying, I use the sensory profile 2 a lot in my assessment work with children and young people because it's a good tool for showing that one individual can have both hyper and hyposensitivities to different stimuli, oversensitive to movement and noise, but seeking out touch and movement or within one sensory mode. Thank you for that comment. I don't know if you wanted to add any more to that at all. Or, sorry?
Yeah, we've used the sensory profile a number of times, and because it does look at each of the different domains, and hyper and hyposensitivity is particularly beneficial in that way. So it does allow you to look at that profile across sensitive domains, which can be really beneficial. And as you say, in emphasizing those very individual profiles for students.
Could I just ask on that, in terms of hyposensitivity and it being more difficult to spot, what are the educational implications of that, where it seems hypersensitivity seems easier to understand how that's going to impact learning, but in hyposensitivity, what kind of
It's a really good question, and it's funny, we've been talking, I mean, Teresa Tavasli does a lot of work in this area as well, and we've been having a lot of conversations recently with her about you know, that whole profile of how to best capture that profile of sensory differences. We're quite good at picking up on hyperreactivity. We're relatively good at picking up on sensory seeking, although I'm not sure that's always attributed in the right way. We're not very good at picking up on hyposensitivity, but a lot of autistic people aren't very good, I say not very good, not very aware of things that they're hyposensitive to, and often they're aware of it because somebody has said, you're actually blue with the cold, I think you need to put a coat on now. It's a really difficult thing to measure, and I don't think we're very good at doing it. And yeah, I'm probably not answering your question now. I'm just really saying it's a bit of a problem, and actually it's a bit of a hard nut to crack, because actually Karen McLennan and Teresa Tavasli did some really nice work with autistic adults. I think the paper's called In Their Own Words. They really just asked autistic adults about their experiences in various different sensory domains. And where they had reports of hyposensitivity, although there were relatively few, it was reports around, well, somebody has told me that, you know, I go blue with the cold and I don't really notice it. So I'm sort of saying it's really difficult. I guess that's my answer.
Yes. I'll move on to another question here from Eugene Ra. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name there. So thank you for the informative presentation. For the first study, I'm curious whether visual and auditory stimuli were relevant to each other. Also, did you have a chance to compare the pre-mentioned result to the case where the background display is inconsistent with the learning contents?
So the first bit of that question was around whether the visual and auditory stimuli were related or relevant to each other. And the answer is they weren't. We were really trying to replicate, in as much as we could in the lab, some of the sensory stimulation that you might get in the classroom. And by and large, you know, the noise and babble and bustle that you might hear from a group of children won't be related necessarily to what's on the walls. So we used kind of typical classroom displays that you would get in a typical classroom. So a mixture of learning aids like times tables, information displays like, you know, the parts of a computer, and also some children's artwork. And the background noise that we played was a particular audio track taken in a classroom of kind of babble and bustle and moving furniture, and, you know, you could hear sort of pens on paper and stuff like that. So no, they weren't related to each other. What was the second part of the question?
The second part was, did you have a chance to compare the pre-mentioned results to the case where the background display is inconsistent with the learning content?
That's what we did. I think that's what you've just said.
I think that's probably what I just said, yeah.
So is the advice there for teachers to remove kind of visual displays from all of their classroom, or just the front, or is?
Yeah, I mean, it's really not, because I don't think we have the evidence to make that kind of a claim, you know. And what I would say is we're actually working on a proposal to kind of take this forward and work that out a little bit more. So, for example, Barrett and colleagues, who are a group of built environment researchers from Salford, did some really lovely work on naturalistic observations of classrooms from about 150 classrooms in the UK. And they measured different aspects of the built environment, like how much natural light and air quality and things like that. But they also measured complexity from the classroom environment, of which visual displays on walls kind of formed part of. And they found that complexity was a significant predictor of learning, and learning measured by national curriculum level tests. But they found that there was like it was a curvilinear relationship. There was an optimal level. So both too much and too little predicted poorer learning outcomes on national curriculum levels. So the suggestion there is that there's an optimal level. Now, what that optimal level is and for whom it's optimal, I think are still very open questions, because, for example, in that study, you know, the authors kind of suggested, although they didn't have data to speak directly to, they suggested that actually for children with special education or additional learning needs at school, that relationship might be different. So what is the optimal level, and what kind of displays are, you know, attractive but not distracting? And for whom is it optimal? I think they're still open questions.
So we've gone past 5 o'clock now. I don't know if we could maybe squeeze one question in. And so another one from Julie is asking, it's interesting that many of the quotes locate the difficulty in the child, not the environment. Do you find this is typical of teacher descriptions of difficulties?
That's really interesting. I hadn't actually reflected on that before.
But in those quotes, we were largely asking about the barriers for the child, the barriers for the learner. So I think that they might be thinking about the learner rather than the broader environment. So we might need to think about asking the question in a slightly different way to ensure that they do think equally about the learner and the environment. I suspect they were slightly probed to think about the child more than the environment in those particular examples. But it would certainly be something for us to look at that I don't think we have looked at really.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
So yeah, we should probably wrap up. Thank you so much for your presentation, Mary and Debbie. It's really interesting. And we can send, if you give us the links to the websites, we can send them around on the when we send the recording. But thank you everyone else for coming along as well, and for the interesting discussion. Hopefully you can join us next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.